and I'm requesting that Stallone appear in my film." He then gave the producers a call. He didn't speak to me, so I suppose I made a mistake. How did Sylvester Stallone actually get hurt by Jean-Claude Van Damme? And why, after decades of silence, is Stallone suddenly coming up about it? We reveal the startling reality of a situation that Stallone has finally chosen to acknowledge in this video. A moment that made an impression yet wasn't featured in any film. Breaking his silence. Sylvester Stallone describes what Jean-Claude Van Damme did to him. It's not good either. This has nothing to do with Hollywood drama. It's about a private border being violated and a silent fallout that nobody anticipated. Stay with us, because this will alter your entire perspective. Two legends rise. Sylvester Stallone and Jean-Claude Van Damme were two figures who started to define action amid the haze of 1980s Hollywood. Stallone was already well established in American popular culture, albeit as a symbol rather than an actor. He had gone from being a struggling screenwriter to a global icon, thanks to Rocky Balboa. Stallone wasn't riding high by the time First Blood debuted in theaters in 1982. The wave was him. Every studio desired bigger explosions, more roughness, and more strength. Stallone succeeded in every way. His films were more than just box office successes. They were patriotic occasions. As other performers struggled to establish themselves, Stallone was making money. Who was up and coming didn't matter to him. He resided above the mountain, a young man with the accuracy of a gymnast and a body shaped by unrelenting discipline was gazing at movie posters in Belgium, thousands of miles away, and hoping to see his own name up there, as if he was already well known. Jean-Claude Van Damme trained. His escape was martial arts, not just his love. He observed every move made by Bruce Lee. He had an obsession with form and body mechanics. With a wallet almost empty and a duffel bag full of hopes, he boarded an aircraft to the United States as if that weren't enough. Only in Los Angeles could what followed have come to pass. Initially, Van Damme distributed headshots at eateries. He was a pizza delivery guy, a carpet cleaner, and a limousine driver. He slept on couches owned by friends. He entered studios without permission every day and recited his now famous line, "You'll see, I'm going to be a movie star." Most folks rolled their eyes at the moment. Even though they had heard it all before, Van Damme continued to appear. He didn't go away. He became more assertive and louder, and after a while, someone replied in the affirmative. In 1988, he made his breakthrough with Bloodsport. The success of the film was not anticipated. Both the budget and the expectations were modest. However, Van Damme's speed, adaptability, and that now iconic spinning kick captivated the fans. Overnight, the movie made him a household name. The floodgates opened from there. Lionheart, double impact, kickboxer. Now that Van Damme was here, he was not going to slow down. Fans likened him to Steven Seagal or Chuck Norris, but Van Damme's focus was on Stallone. He recognized in him the ultimate test of achievement. Despite not being a martial artist, Stallone had the kind of career Van Damme desired. Dominance at the box office worldwide, celebrity status, and a spot in the canon of stars. Van Damme expressed appreciation for Stallone in interviews. He saw all the films. He observed Stallone's mannerisms. In press junkets, he even imitated his speech patterns. It appeared to be hero worship to some. Others saw it as a tactic. For his part, Stallone had listened. Audiences adored Van Damme, who was everywhere. However, Hollywood is small, and news spreads quickly. Stories about Van Damme's eagerness to meet Stallone and his increased persistence started to circulate among the agencies. How he appeared to be using all means necessary to get access to Stallone's circles, even attending events to which he was not invited. It was innocuous at first. Van Damme stood out from the scores of young men Stallone had witnessed vying for attention. There was no cue for him. He was ignoring it. Soon after, an incident happened that transformed the admiration into something more serious, unsolved, and something Stallone would not discuss for years. Not in public. Not till today. Van Damme's unique path to stardom. Although ambition was the foundation of Los Angeles, Jean-Claude Van Damme's ambition caused people to take notice. It was impolite. It wasn't nuanced. It was loud, relentless, and frequently intimate. He continued talking until someone said yes, regardless of who replied no. He had a heavy accent. He had a surprising charm. But it was hard to ignore his resolve. People in the field began to take notice of him because he kept knocking on doors. Not because of his resume. Literally. He would arrive at the offices of producers without a reservation. He would go up to celebrities in dining establishments. Once, he was seen running across a studio parking lot to catch up to a casting agent who was going into her vehicle. "Please see him kick," he pleaded. He smiled as if it were perfectly natural as he slid into a split between two cars in the center of the lot. That's how he worked. His actions were a mix of desperation and hustling. He was dismissed by most. A few found it amusing. Some were uncomfortable. But waiting quietly in the wings was not going to get Van Damme to his one goal. His methods of integrating himself into industry circles became the subject of rumors. He disguised himself as a delivery man and sneaked onto a studio backlot, only to wind up shadow boxing in front of a stunt coordinator. According to one story. According to another, he once went into a gym that Stallone frequently visited, but not to exercise, but to unintentionally run into the man. The stories got longer with each recounting, whether it was genuine or not. The most persistent rumors, however, concerned his developing fixation on Stallone. According to several insiders, it went beyond admiration. They said that Van Damme was keeping tabs on Stallone's whereabouts, that he was spotted loitering outside of gatherings that Stallone attended, and that he was using connections to approach him in ways that felt more like strategy than networking. Nevertheless, Van Damme's reputation kept growing. Bloodsport helped him get a job. He became a franchise name, thanks to Kickboxer. Double Impact demonstrated to studios that he could play multiple roles. He didn't appear content, though, even as the scripts came in and the compensation increased. He had no desire to make money. Stature was what he was after. For Van Damme, that meant being welcomed by the same individuals who had previously disregarded him. That ranking still had Stallone at the top. One significant incident signaled a change. At Stallone's estate, a well-known Hollywood party was held. Many of the guests were well-known celebrities. Some were up-and-coming names. Despite not being invited, Van Damme turned up. He was not instantly recognized by the gate guards. Perhaps he smiled confidently. He may have persuaded them with his words, but he managed to get in. Those who witnessed it said that Van Damme did not enter via the hedges or through a back window. Like he belonged, he strode in the front. He socialized with producers inside, posed for pictures, and even approached a few directors to make a proposal. When Stallone finally noticed him, there was a moment, a prolonged stare, and an unpleasant beep. Most people thought he was someone's. According to reports, Stallone nodded and continued. Something lingered in the air that night despite the silence. Even if no one said it out loud, everyone could sense that Van Damme had entered an area that wasn't intended for him. The rest of what happened is unclear. While some claim Stallone ignored it, others disagree. Whatever the truth, that night sowed the seeds for a slow-burning conflict that would simmer silently behind the scenes, until one day, Stallone felt he had something to say. It wasn't a seed for friendship or partnership. In private, something nobody was aware of. The tale of Jean-Claude Van Damme's visit to Sylvester Stallone's home lingered in Hollywood for years like a joke. At dinner parties, it was one of those stories that people told, half believing it and half not. However, underneath the surface appeal and the laughter, there was something else that bothered the people who were present that evening. The party was intended to be a relaxed get-together that wasn't very large or known for throwing exclusive parties with carefully chosen attendees. Stallone had invited a select group of actors, producers, and longtime friends. Brigitte Nielsen, his then wife, had assisted in planning the event. She was now a well-known individual in her own right. She was also known to be extremely protective of her personal space, despite the fact that she frequently kept her cool around the Hollywood crowd. Van Damme showed up after the sun had set and the champagne had begun to pour. The list did not include him. He was not anticipated. According to some, he brought another visitor. Others thought he approached the security guard by himself and used his words to get past them. The specifics are still unknown, but one thing is for sure: he got inside. According to reports, the instant he walked in, the atmosphere changed. Subtly, not dramatically, not like a movie's record scratch moment. People took notice. Like old friends, he greeted strangers. He praised the artwork, the furnishings, even the dog of Stallone. Then he started to look for Sly himself. It took very little time. Stallone was talking to a filmmaker beside the pool. Van Damme smiled broadly as he walked up, held out his hand, and said a line he had been practicing for years. At last, I succeeded. Unexpectedly, Stallone shook his hand. However, one witness claimed that his face froze. Nielsen, standing close by, remained silent. She gave Van Damme a look, then turned to face her spouse. There was a chilly gaze, and the mood became tense after that. Stallone didn't find this flattering, but Van Damme was unaware of it or didn't care to notice. It was obtrusive to him. A long-time acquaintance of Stallone claims that the actor was already aware of Van Damme's local feats. The studio ambushes, the gym drop-ins, and the practiced praises on red carpets. Even though he had seen Van Damme before, this was the first time he had felt surrounded. According to reports, Stallone asked a pal who the hell informed him he could be here later that night as the celebration started to wind down. It was a rhetorical inquiry. It wasn't frustration. After that, there were rumors, but nothing official or verified. According to others, Van Damme stood too near and talked too much while following Brigitte Nielsen around the house. Others claimed that he had mistaken his audacity for charm and strolled into private places. The tabloids never reported on any of this. It remained on the periphery. However, the impression had been made, and not in a positive way. Eventually, Van Damme departed, perhaps unwilling to admit the harm he had caused, or oblivious to it. It was another step towards visibility, in his opinion. It was something very different to Stallone. The story became softer with time. In interviews, Stallone would smirk when he mentioned it. He would reply, chuckling, "He came to my house," because it was a humorous story about two action stars meeting. Audiences thought it was harmless. What transpired while the cameras weren't rolling, however, was never questioned. Nobody inquired about Stallone's true feelings. It wasn't until recently, decades later, that the smirk vanished and Stallone, clearly upset, finally expressed what he had been thinking about all along. Silence is broken by Stallone. Sylvester Stallone kept the story a secret for years. The Van Damme incident was always edited down for late-night interviews and presented as a humorous recollection. The majority believed it to be another aberration from Hollywood, a young, arrogant martial artist who shows up without invitation in an attempt to win over the genre's monarch. It was an interesting story, until Stallone's laughter eventually subsided. During a recent interview, after filming in silence and releasing it without any fanfare, Stallone decided he had had enough, and it wasn't some lost party story that he disclosed. It was a recollection that was obviously never comfortable for him, and was still tinged with annoyance. Stallone clenched his jaw and remarked, "Jean-Claude was not respectful. He wasn't a visitor. No one invited him. I didn't trust him enough to be in there. There was no interruption from the interviewer. Here, there was no script." Stallone was remembering, not performing. Furthermore, his recollections were unrelated to mentorship or admiration. He gave a detailed account of the evening. Van Damme had sneaked past security, entered his house without notice, and proceeded through it as if he owned it. He went up to strangers he had never met. He lingered too close to Stallone's spouse. He continued pitching himself as if the room owed him a career, ignoring body language and other cues. For decades, Stallone had publicly dismissed it, but he made it plain as he sat there now, older and more shrewd than before. He claimed that ambition wasn't the focus of that evening. It has to do with ego. He intended to demonstrate his ability to gain entry, and he succeeded. However, I never forgot it. Sylvester Stallone finally spoke out about what Jean-Claude Van Damme had done to him. It's not good either. It was more than just an infringement. It was intimate. It was not the arrival that troubled him the most. It was the disdain. Van Damme acted as though no one else in the room mattered, ignoring social signs, boundaries, and private areas. Stallone went on. It wasn't confidence. Simply put, it was disdain. My spouse witnessed it. My pals witnessed it. I saw it, hell. However, I didn't want headlines at the moment. Drama was not what I wanted. He said that he avoided Van Damme after that, and that he always passed on projects when his name was mentioned. It is based on principle rather than competitiveness. Without hesitation, Stallone responded to the question of why he ultimately chose Van Damme for the Expendables 2. Because the position required someone who could stare you down without blinking, someone who was icy. He had that in him, I knew. They collaborated. On screen, they engaged in combat. However, there was no reconciliation, no forgiveness, and no grudges buried deep. According to Stallone, the set remained silent, and they only communicated when absolutely required, between takes. He didn't leave the interview feeling resentful. He didn't insult anyone. He did, however, softly add one final observation. You have folks you respect and those you work with. They aren't always the same. The renown of Van Damme's most audacious Hollywood stunt vanished in an instant. The truth was colder than anyone had anticipated, and the stillness had ended. We never witnessed the repercussions. When Stallone eventually spoke about what happened with Van Damme, it didn't make a splash. Neither hot hashtags nor urgent headlines were present. Silently, it came and disappeared. The interview, which was one of those lengthy sit-downs where actors reflect more than promote, was shown on a lesser platform. The ones who needed to hear it, those who had been present, and those who remembered the night in question were able to hear it. But the majority of the world missed it. Some were taken aback by Stallone's statements. He never complained about anything. His profession was based on silence, grit, and strength. But it was obvious from the look on his face. Too long he had been sitting with this. Subtle clues were recognizable to those who had worked with him over the years. On set, Stallone's expression tightened as Van Damme's name was called. A meeting when the topic of discussion changed after Van Damme was proposed for a position. It never appeared to be a feud. It wasn't warm, though. The reason for the wall's existence was finally realized. The article filled in the gaps inside the sector. It was a response to a query that had persisted for years, not a scandal. Why hadn't Stallone and Van Damme worked together while they were at their best? When all the other action heroes appeared to cross over into each other's worlds, why hadn't they stood together? Now, the quiet made sense. Competition had never been the issue. It had been intimate. Some of the crew recalled the anxiety while working on The Expendables 2. There wasn't much conversation during the scene's rehearsal. In his caravan, Van Damme stayed. Stallone kept with the core team. When necessary, they shook hands. They posed for pictures in the media. But aside from the job, there was no relationship. People thought it was a sign of professionalism. It was something else in retrospect. That distance had existed from the beginning. Van Damme didn't answer. No interview, not a quote. According to those close to him, he had no plans to go back in time. He didn't remember that night the way Stallone did, according to several. It might have been just one of several bold moves made by Van Damme. However, it wasn't just another night for Stallone. It had altered his perception of him, and nothing that came after it ever quite reversed that. Stallone's friends said that following the interview, he didn't bring it up again. Not that he had intended to. In the moment, it came out, like a window that briefly opens before shutting. After saying what he had to say, he continued. There was no conventional reaction, no media frenzy, and no agency contacts. A different version of the narrative, however, was now ingrained in the memories of those who had been in those rooms and who had always heard it as a joke. It was a little heavier, quieter, and more honest. Fans of Van Damme continue to adore his flicks. The legacy of Stallone has not changed. However, there was always an uneasy feeling between them. Something that never quite healed. It wasn't noisy or public. Perhaps that's all it was ever intended to be. A door that never opened again. A friendship that never materialized. A line crossed. A moment recalled. It had been years since that night. The house is different now. The populace has evolved. The public no longer remembers the actual moment. For Sylvester Stallone, however, not all memories are stored away. Unspoken and unaffected, they simply sit there. He never again mentioned Van Damme in interviews or memoirs. He let that one exchange do the talking. There had been enough time for the words to linger. They would have become less valuable if they were repeated. For his part, Van Damme said nothing. He never changed Stallone's story, whether out of pride, self-control, or apathy. He did not refute it. He made no defense of it. Perhaps he reasoned that nothing was worth reopening, because the moment had already occurred. Perhaps he had a different memory of it. Or perhaps he understood in his heart that Stallone had always viewed him as an intruder who had remained too long. The most peculiar aspect is that the two guys never again came into contact, albeit their paths occasionally went parallel. There was no spin-off, sequel reunion, or unexpected cameo following The Expendables 2. Stallone persisted in creating enduring ventures. In an effort to change how the world perceived him, Van Damme moved into smaller, more self-aware roles in films where he portrayed varying versions of himself, sometimes wise, sometimes washed up. However, he never changed Stallone's perception of him. Behind the scenes, there was still speculation about what more might have happened that evening, something Van Damme forgot or feigned to do, or something Stallone didn't mention. There had always been hazy rumors of an awkward encounter with Brigitte Nielsen, access to secret rooms, and actions that went beyond multiple boundaries. However, such specifics were never verified. Stallone didn't go into detail. He didn't have to. It was clear from the disappointment in his voice. Now that the tale is complete, it is not a scandal. It's not explosive at all. It's something more subdued and melancholic. Two legendary action figures who had the opportunity to share a historical event never did. In the 1990s, fans frequently dreamed about a Stallone-Van Damme collaboration. A buddy cop movie, perhaps. Perhaps a movie about soldiers and assassins. Something recognizable. The posters were created in dorm rooms by young people who were obsessed with slow-motion fights and biceps. However, neither actor ever fully discussed the reality that lay behind those delusions. They were at odds, out of a line that was crossed early and never uncrossed, not out of rivalry. According to some, Stallone was too severe. Van Damme was overly daring, according to others. However, every one of them was a product of their own eras. The action genre of the 1980s was based on myth and ego. Being the largest, loudest, and most memorable was what everyone aspired to. Apologies didn't have much room. They now reside on opposite ends of the legacy spectrum. Statues are still being carved into the mountain by Stallone. Even while he is still adored and revered, Van Damme is now more of a cult figure. He moves through airports with little commotion. He poses for pictures with his fans. He quips that he has splits. However, the door he entered without authorization never reopened. Perhaps it was the main theme of the entire story. It wasn't a betrayal or a conflict, but rather an instance when someone overreached themselves in the hopes of being remembered as ambitious, when it actually landed as something quite different. Once lost, respect doesn't always come back, and there was simply silence, and the door remaining closed in that silent area between two legends. There was never another word or handshake. Would these two titans of action have created something truly remarkable together if Van Damme had never entered that room? Or was this confrontation always going to happen?